When we talk today about the sexual revolution, we usually refer to the radical change in sexual values that took place in the West in the 20th century. But this was not the first sexual revolution, and it wasn't even the most radical. In fact, another, far more massive sexual revolution occurred nearly 2,000 years earlier when Christianity took root in the 1st century AD and prompted a complete overhaul of the sexual ethics of the dominant superpower of the day, the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, what was sexually permissible and what was taboo were almost entirely based on your social status. If you were a higher status free man, you could have sex with almost anyone you wanted, as long as the other person was not also of high social status or was seen to be the property of someone of high social status.
In the Roman world, Harvey Weinstein would have been completely unremarkable. The idea that a rich, high-status man should have sexual access to his social inferiors, in particular his slaves, was completely unquestioned in the era before Christianity.
Sex with other men, women, boys, and girls was in most cases socially acceptable for these elite men, as long as the high-status man was considered the active partner and not the passive partner.
Next time you want a boy, buy one at the market.
There were many victims of the Romans' cultural sexual hierarchy. Slaves often fared the worst, especially children. For a Roman upper-class man, there was no concept of the sexual abuse of a slave. Slaves were merely property to be used and abused at will. A slave boy or girl was viewed much the same way that many might view pornography today, as a convenient outlet to quickly act on sexual lust. The Roman Empire built an enormous slave system, and slave ownership impacted nearly every element of Roman society, including using slaves' bodies as sexual playthings for their brutal masters. The mechanics of Roman sexuality were shaped by the presence of unfree bodies across the social spectrum, writes the historian Kyle Harper. The ubiquity of slaves meant pervasive sexual availability. Slaves were subjected to untrammeled sexual abuse. Today, we understand consent to be an important standard by which we determine whether a sexual act is ethical or not. But for the myriad of slaves who served as objects for the sexual acts of their freeborn owners, the concept of consent was totally unheard of.
Pay what's owed, and the girl is all yours.
Largely because of the widespread availability of slaves, pederasty, like pedophilia, or sex between men and young boys, was also common in Rome. Since sex was based on social status, slave boys served as objects for their master's brutal lust, cast aside when they grew their first beard to be replaced by a younger boy. And while freeborn elite men had broad sexual license, the sexuality of free women was highly controlled under Roman rule. Women were nearly always under a man's power, whether he be her father or husband. And in many circumstances, she couldn't object if her husband chose to kill their child because it was malformed or an unwanted girl. If a father caught his daughter in the act of adultery, he was allowed to kill his daughter and her lover. Into this sexually abusive world entered Christianity. Imagine being a Roman slave or a low-status woman and hearing the teaching that all human beings, male and female, are made in the image of God. Or the Apostle Paul's words in Galatians for the first time, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Instead of basing sexual ethics on social status, power, and dominance, Christian teaching based sexual ethics on the equal value of every human being. And it upheld freely chosen, one woman, one man, monogamous marriage as the only acceptable context for any sexual activity. Marriage is the covenant that unites a man and a woman to one another and to any children that may proceed from their union. Instead of forced marriage, Christianity required that each spouse freely choose the union. Instead of tolerating sexual infidelity in marriage, Christianity required that each spouse be faithful, the man equally so as the woman. Instead of seeing people of lower classes, women or children as property, Christianity required that they be treated as persons with the same dignity as anyone else. Any sexual act outside of the marriage bed was forbidden. And for those who married, Christian spouses, husbands and wives were taught that their bodies belonged to one another as gifts, the husband's body to the wife and vice versa. Everyone, male or female, high status or slave, was called to live by the same sexual morality. This was a radical teaching that required a dramatic transformation in the treatment of children, lower-class men, and women. To Christians, slaves, children, prostitutes, women, they all had the same moral standing as freeborn or noble men. Abortion and infanticide were also forbidden by Christians. The way that archaeologists today find an ancient brothel is that they look for hundreds of newborn baby bones buried in the ground. These are bones specifically of male infants because the female infants would be raised to be prostitutes themselves. While it was customary among the Romans to abandon unwanted infants to die on trash heaps, Christians would baptize and adopt these babies. Everyone, regardless of their status, had the same individual responsibility and dignity. Is it any surprise that so many of the first converts to Christianity were slaves and women? Many societies in the past have required women to abstain from sex until marriage, but Christianity demanded this of men as well. Many societies demanded women to only have sex with their spouse. Christianity required this of men as well. Gradually, laws and norms began to change as Christianity spread like wildfire throughout the Roman Empire. The first Christian emperor, Constantine, ended the Roman system of unilateral divorce in AD 331 and permitted divorce under only a few serious circumstances. If a man divorced his wife without grave reason for doing so, he had to return her dowry and could not remarry. By the 4th century, the Roman law recognized that slaves could be manumitted or emancipated in a church ritual performed by a priest or bishop. The Christian emperor Valentinian I banned infanticide in AD 374. The early church father John Chrysostom taught that slaves who had joined the church must be treated as equals, and that it would be better if people kept no slaves at all. Chrysostom encouraged slave owners to educate their slaves in a trade and then to free them. In AD 428, the Christian emperor Theodosius II banned the use of coercion in the sex industry. The law was intended to protect slaves and women from being forced into prostitution. Far from imposing an oppressive patriarchy, Christian sexual ethics elevated virtually everyone in society. The value of slaves, women, and children were no longer based on their social status, but on their status as children of God. And freely chosen, faithful marriage, not social status, became the measure for sexual morality. Monogamy eliminated all other forms of sexual license, especially protecting vulnerable children, women, and slaves from the lusts of powerful men. The legacy of Christianity lies in the dissolution of an ancient system where status and social reproduction scripted the terms of sexual morality, Harper writes. The transition from a late classical to a Christian sexual morality marked a paradigm shift, a quantum leap to a new foundational logic of sexual ethics in which the cosmos replaced the city as the framework of morality. Christian sexual ethics eventually became the norm in the Western world. This was a gradual process as jurisprudence and cultural expectations developed over the course of the next 2,000 years. But for close to 2 millennia, there was a near universal understanding in the Western world that an enduring marriage between a man and a woman was the bedrock of civilization. Ethical values centered on the idea that sexual activity belongs within the bond of marriage between a man and a woman who were open to children. Today, with the modern sexual revolution well underway, we've been breaking down this system of sexual ethics that has been the standard for the past 2,000 years. A combination of toxic ideologies, including Marxism, second-wave feminism, and hedonistic post-relativism, has rejected these ethics in the name of equality for women, or liberation, or dismantling the patriarchy, but it doesn't make good on its promises. The reality is the sexual revolution of the 20th century hasn't led us to a brighter future. Instead, our modern sexual revolution has destroyed the lives and the happiness of millions of people. Can the same sexual ethics that revolutionized Roman society, proclaiming the dignity of every man, woman, and child, regardless of social status, and elevating the value of fidelity and sacrificial love, be the antidote to today's chaos and misery? Let's find out.